I don't want to be driven around by the likes of you." The words rang through the nearly full bus like a gunshot. The passengers fell silent. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rain tapping against the windows. The man who had shouted was in his late 50s, with greying hair, a thick moustache, and a scowl that looked permanently etched into his face. He stood near the front of the bus, gripping the metal rail as if holding on to his own superiority. His narrowed eyes were fixed on the driver, a tall black man with calm, steady hands on the wheel. The driver, Marcus, didn't flinch. He had heard it all before, but something about this moment felt different. "Sir, please take your seat," Marcus said, his voice firm but even. The man scoffed. "You think you can tell me what to do? You probably barely know how to drive this thing." He turned to the other passengers as if expecting them to join in. "I bet he doesn't even belong in this country." Murmurs of disapproval rippled through the bus. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others glared at the man in disgust. Marcus gripped the wheel tighter, forcing himself to stay calm. He had been driving for over a decade, and no matter how many times he faced situations like this, they never got easier. The bus doors remained open, rain splattering onto the floor. "Sir, either take your seat or you're free to leave," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. The man's face turned red with fury. He took a step forward, as if challenging Marcus. And then, just as tensions reached their peak, "Do you even know who he is?" A woman's voice cut through the silence. All eyes turned toward an elderly lady sitting near the middle of the bus. She wore a navy blue raincoat, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath a scarf. She wasn't just a regular passenger. She knew something the others didn't. The racist man frowned. "What are you talking about?" The old woman leaned forward, her eyes piercing. "If you knew who was driving this bus, you'd be ashamed of yourself." A few passengers exchanged curious glances. Marcus let out a slow breath. He knew exactly where this was going, because his identity, it was no ordinary one. And soon, this man was about to find out the shocking truth. The bus was dead silent. The racist man's face twisted in confusion. "What do you mean if I knew who he was? He's just a bus driver." His voice was sharp, laced with frustration. The elderly woman chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Oh, son, you have no idea." Marcus shifted in his seat, his grip tightening on the wheel. He had spent years trying to keep a low profile, but some secrets couldn't stay hidden forever. The woman looked around at the other passengers. "I don't usually get involved in nonsense like this," she said, "but I can't sit back and watch a man like you make a fool of yourself." The racist man scoffed. "And what makes him so special, huh?" The old woman met his glare, her eyes sharp. "Why don't you ask him?" The passengers turned to Marcus, their curiosity piqued. Marcus sighed. He hated attention like this. It had been years since his past life had mattered to anyone. But now, with the whole bus waiting, he had no choice. "Sir," he finally said, his deep voice calm, "what if I told you I wasn't always a bus driver?" The man crossed his arms. "Oh yeah? And what were you before? A janitor? A grocery bagger?" A few passengers gasped at his words, but Marcus didn't react. Instead, he simply said, "I used to be a colonel in the United States Army." Silence. The man's smirk disappeared instantly. His jaw tightened. The bus suddenly felt too small, too quiet. The elderly woman smirked. "You see now." Marcus leaned back, waiting. He had dropped the first piece of the puzzle. But this was just the beginning. Because what the man didn't know? Marcus wasn't just any soldier, and soon he was about to learn the full, shocking truth. The bus remained eerily silent, the weight of Marcus's words pressing down on everyone. The racist man, who had been so loud just moments ago, opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. You were in the army," he finally stammered. Marcus nodded slowly, his face unreadable. "Not just in the army," the elderly woman added, her eyes gleaming. "He was one of the best, a decorated officer, a war hero." Murmurs spread through the bus. People glanced at each other, at Marcus, then back at the man who had just humiliated himself in front of everyone. "Bullshit," the man scoffed, though his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. "You're telling me this guy, this bus driver, is some kind of hero? That's a joke." Marcus's hands tightened on the wheel. "Believe whatever you want," he said, his tone calm. "I don't need to prove anything to you." The old woman chuckled. "You should listen, boy. You have no idea who you're messing with." The racist man clenched his fists. His pride wouldn't let him back down so easily. "Fine," he snapped. "If he's such a big shot, then tell me. Why is he here? If he was a decorated officer, why the hell is he driving a damn bus?" A heavy silence fell over the bus. Marcus took a slow breath. He had asked himself that same question 1,000 times. Finally, he turned to meet the man's gaze. "Because I made a promise," he said simply. The man frowned. "A promise?" Marcus's jaw tightened. His mind drifted back to a memory, one he had buried deep. A battlefield, the sound of gunfire, the last words of a dying soldier. "Yeah," Marcus said quietly. "A promise that changed everything." The air in the bus thickened with curiosity. The racist man crossed his arms. "Oh, yeah? And what kind of promise was that?" Marcus exhaled, gripping the wheel tightly. "The kind that cost me everything." The entire bus held its breath, because they could all feel it. This story was far from over. The bus rumbled on, but no one seemed to notice. Every passenger leaned in slightly, waiting for Marcus's answer. The racist man, his name was Greg, shifted uncomfortably, but his pride wouldn't let him look away. He had started this fight, and now he had to see it through. Marcus exhaled, gripping the wheel as if bracing himself. "It was years ago," he said, his voice quieter now. "A different life, a different world." He didn't want to go back there, but he could already see it. The scorching desert sun, the scent of dust and gunpowder, the pounding in his chest as he ran, carrying a wounded soldier on his back. "We were surrounded," Marcus continued. "Cut off from our unit, just 5 of us left. One of my men, Private Daniels, had been hit bad. We couldn't carry him and run. He knew it." His knuckles turned white against the steering wheel. "He grabbed my arm and looked me dead in the eyes, told me I had to make him a promise." The bus was dead silent. Greg swallowed hard, but forced himself to speak. "And what did he say?" Marcus hesitated. His voice was thick with something unspoken when he finally answered. "He told me, 'Get home, Sarge, and when you do, don't just live, make a difference.'" The words hung in the air. "I told him I would." Marcus's jaw clenched. His next words were almost a whisper. "And then I left him there." A heavy weight settled over the bus. No one knew what to say. Greg looked like he wanted to say something, maybe an insult, maybe a challenge, but for the first time he hesitated. Marcus let the silence stretch before he spoke again. "I made it home, but Daniels didn't." He swallowed hard. "And I wasn't the same man anymore." His grip on the wheel loosened slightly as he stared at the road ahead. "I could have taken a high-ranking job, something cushy, but that promise, it haunted me. So I started small, helping where I could. And somehow, I ended up here, driving this bus." Greg scoffed, but there was no fire behind it. "You're telling me you gave up everything because of a promise to some dead soldier?" Marcus finally turned to him, his eyes unreadable. "No," he said. "I gave up everything because that soldier believed in a better world. And if I don't try to build it, Then who will? Silence. Greg's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The old woman in the back nodded knowingly. Now you understand, don't you? Greg's fingers twitched. His face was unreadable, but for the first time he wasn't looking at Marcus with anger. He was looking at him with something else, something dangerously close to respect. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping against his knee. He had expected Marcus to snap, to get defensive, maybe even to threaten him. But this quiet, unshakable dignity, it unsettled him. So what? Greg muttered, though his voice lacked its earlier bite. You think that makes you some kind of hero? Marcus sighed, keeping his eyes on the road. No, he said simply. I think it makes me a man trying to keep his word. The bus rolled to a stop at a red light. Outside, the city bustled, people rushing to work, kids laughing, life moving forward, unaware of the battle raging inside Greg's head. Greg shook his head, forcing out a dry laugh. You know what your problem is, bus driver? You think one good deed erases everything? It doesn't. Marcus turned slightly, meeting Greg's gaze in the mirror. And what exactly do you think I need to erase? Greg hesitated. The question had come too fast, too direct. His hands clenched into fists. I just know your type. Act all righteous, like you're better than the rest of us, but deep down, you're just another guy looking for a free pass. A murmur rippled through the bus. The passengers had heard enough. An older black man sitting near the front leaned forward. Son, you ever serve? He asked Greg, his voice carrying the weight of age and wisdom. Greg stiffened. No. The old man nodded slowly. Then you don't know what it means to carry a promise like that, to leave a man behind and live with it every day. Greg's jaw twitched. I don't need to serve to know when someone's playing the victim. Marcus inhaled sharply, gripping the wheel. The light turned green. Victim? He repeated, his voice dangerously calm. The bus rolled forward. You think a man who holds his head up, does his job, and keeps a promise to a dead friend is a victim? Greg crossed his arms, leaning back. I think you use it as an excuse, to act like you're better than everyone else. A sharp laugh came from the back. It was the older woman again. Boy, she said, shaking her head, this man just told you about carrying his brother through war, and you still can't see past your own bitterness? Greg's face flushed, but he didn't respond. Marcus exhaled through his nose. Let me ask you something, Greg. Greg looked up, wary. What do you do? Greg blinked. What? Your job? Your life? What do you do? Greg hesitated. I work at a dealership. Selling cars? Yeah, Marcus nodded. Ever help someone get a car they really needed? Greg frowned. What? You ever help a struggling family? Cut them a deal? Help someone who couldn't afford it? Greg shifted in his seat. A couple times, yeah. Why? Greg opened his mouth, but no words came out. The bus was silent. Marcus turned his eyes back to the road. You see, Greg, maybe we're not so different after all. Greg swallowed. His heart pounded against his ribs, and for the first time, doubt crept into his mind. The bus continued forward, but something in Greg's world had just stopped. If you're enjoying this story and want more captivating tales like this, don't forget to subscribe to Storytelling Sphere. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Your support keeps these powerful stories coming. Now let's dive back into the story, Greg scoffed, shaking his head. Oh, come on. Don't compare what I do to whatever you think you are. I sell cars. I don't stand here pretending to be some kind of saint. Marcus kept his hands steady on the wheel. And I don't pretend either, Greg. I just do my job. Just like you. But Greg wasn't done. He could feel something slipping. Control, maybe? His identity? He wasn't sure, but he had to grab onto something before the weight of the moment crushed him. Yeah, well, you're still just a bus driver. The words left his mouth sharper than he intended, and the second they did, a hush fell over the bus. Marcus exhaled through his nose. A quiet laugh, though not amused. It was the kind of laugh that carried years of restraint, of battles fought and endured. Just a bus driver, Marcus repeated. The old man near the front shook his head. The woman in the back muttered something under her breath. Even the usual noise of the city outside felt distant, muffled. Marcus tapped the wheel once before speaking. Tell me something, Greg. What do you see when you look at me? Greg rolled his eyes. What? Is this a therapy session now? Just answer. Greg folded his arms. I see a guy driving a bus. Probably didn't have any other options. Probably blames the system for why he's stuck here. Marcus hummed, nodding slowly. Interesting. Greg scoffed. What's interesting? That you assume I didn't have a choice. Greg frowned, but Marcus wasn't done. What if I told you I chose this job? Greg blinked. What? What if I told you I walked away from 6 figures, from an office, from a suit and tie, than to be right here? Greg let out a short, skeptical laugh. Why the hell would anyone do that? Marcus glanced at him in the mirror. His voice was steady. Because I made a promise. Greg's breath caught. Marcus kept going. My best friend, his name was James. We served together. We had a dream of coming back and making the world better in small ways. He wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to work with people. Simple things, real things. But James didn't make it home. The bus was silent. Before he died, he made me promise to keep going, to do something that mattered, no matter how small. So I did. Greg swallowed hard. Marcus nodded at the passengers. These folks? They're not just faces. They're stories. A single mother who works 2 shifts. A veteran trying to find his way back. A student chasing his dreams. Every day I drive, and every day I get to be a part of something bigger than myself. That's not being stuck, Greg. That's purpose. Greg shifted, his throat suddenly dry. That's just some feel-good nonsense. Marcus didn't argue. He just let the words hang there. Greg didn't know why, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he even believed his own words. The air inside the bus felt heavier after Marcus's words, but Greg wasn't ready to admit anything yet. His pride wouldn't let him. He shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. Yeah, well, good for you, he muttered, turning to look out the window. That's when it happened. A loud bang, then another. The screech of tires. The unmistakable sound of metal crushing against metal. Screams. Marcus's instincts kicked in before anyone else's. With a firm grip on the wheel, he kept the bus steady as a sedan spun out of control right in front of them, colliding with a streetlight. Greg's heart pounded. A child was trapped inside. Through the shattered windshield, he could see a little girl in the back seat, her face streaked with tears, frozen in terror. Without thinking, Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt. "Stay here," he commanded. But Greg, before he could stop himself, was already moving. He didn't know why. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was something deeper. But for the first time in a long time, Greg wasn't just watching. He was doing something. Marcus leaped from the bus before anyone could react. His feet hit the pavement hard as he sprinted toward the wrecked car. Greg stood frozen in place. Why is he running into danger like that? Smoke curled from the car's crumpled hood. The mother in the driver's seat was unconscious, her head slumped forward. The little girl in the back seat banged her tiny fists against the window, screaming. Marcus reached for the door. Locked. Greg saw him take a step back, brace himself, then slam his elbow against the glass. Crack. The first hit didn't do much, neither did the second. Greg's breath hitched. The smoke was getting worse, if they didn't get the kid out soon. Without thinking, Greg ran forward. "Here!" he yelled, grabbing a metal rod from the roadside. He shoved it into Marcus's hands. Marcus didn't hesitate. With one powerful swing, the window shattered. The little girl coughed, eyes wide with fear. "Help!" Marcus carefully reached in, unbuckling her seatbelt. He pulled her into his arms, shielding her from the shards of glass as he carried her out. Just then, the car made a terrible groaning sound. The engine was still running. Smoke poured from beneath the hood. The mother was still inside. Marcus didn't stop. He turned to Greg, shoving the little girl into his arms. "Hold her," he ordered, before diving back into the wreckage. Greg stood there, the child clutching his shirt, sobbing into his chest. His mind raced. His hands shook. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to trusting someone like Marcus. The flames licked hungrily at the engine, creeping toward the cabin. Time was running out. Marcus gritted his teeth, wrenching at the driver's door handle. Stuck. Inside, the woman stirred, groaning weakly. The smoke made her movements sluggish. She was barely conscious. Marcus slammed his shoulder against the door. Once, twice. It didn't budge. Behind him, Greg's panicked voice cut through the chaos. "Get out of there, man! It's gonna blow!" Marcus ignored him. He grabbed the metal rod and jammed it under the handle, using every ounce of his strength. The door popped open just as the fire reached the dashboard. The woman let out a weak cry as Marcus hoisted her into his arms and stumbled back, his lungs burning. Then, boom! A deafening explosion rocked the street, sending a wave of heat rolling over them. Greg instinctively turned, shielding the little girl with his body. When he looked back, Marcus was on the ground, shielding the woman with his own body, his uniform singed, his hands trembling from the shock. For a second, everything was eerily silent. Then, the child in Greg's arms screamed, "Mommy!" The woman stirred, blinking against the smoke. She reached weakly toward her daughter. Marcus exhaled in relief. She was alive. Greg stood frozen, his mind racing. Moments ago, he saw Marcus as nothing more than a bus driver. Now, he saw something else. A man who just risked his life without hesitation. A hero. Greg stood there staring at Marcus, his mind battling between old prejudices and the undeniable truth in front of him. The man he had insulted, belittled, and disrespected just risked his own life to save someone. The woman clung to her daughter, tears streaming down her soot-streaked face as she whispered, "Thank you, thank you," over and over again. Marcus sat up slowly, his chest rising and falling with deep, labored breaths. His uniform was covered in soot, his hands trembling from the adrenaline. He barely acknowledged the praise. His only concern was whether the woman and child were safe. Greg felt a lump in his throat. A man like Marcus could have walked away. He could have let the fire consume the car, let the mother and child suffer the worst. But he didn't, and that was the difference. For the first time, Greg felt ashamed, not because someone was calling him out, not because of fear of consequences, but because he had been so wrong about Marcus. As the distant sound of sirens filled the air, Greg turned to Marcus. His voice was rough, hesitant. "Hey, man, are you okay?" Marcus glanced at him, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. It was the first time Greg had spoken to him like a human being, and somehow that hit harder than any insult ever could. As tensions continued to simmer, the bus, still holding its collective breath, made its final stop for the day. The angry man's eyes were still fixed on the bus driver, his glare unyielding. He had no idea the weight of the moment he was about to experience. "You'll pay for this, you filthy! I won't let this go!" The man spat, still flaring with hatred. His voice was shaky, his anger rising. But what he didn't know was that this was the last time he would ever be allowed to speak to anyone that way again. The bus driver, who had been silent up until now, stood tall as he made his way towards the doors. The man's heart skipped a beat as the bus driver turned around, facing him directly. And then, the man saw it. It was subtle at first, just a glimpse of something familiar in the bus driver's eyes. His calm demeanor, the way he carried himself with an authority that the man didn't expect. This was someone who had seen things, someone who was not to be underestimated. "Do you know who I am?" the bus driver asked, his voice low but commanding. The man paused, his voice faltering. He was taken aback. "What? What are you talking about?" A sudden wave of realization hit him. The bus driver didn't look like an ordinary man. He didn't look like anyone who could be disrespected and discarded so easily. The man's confidence faltered, but before he could even process the situation further, the bus driver spoke again. "You've been rude and you've caused a scene," the bus driver continued, his voice unwavering. "But there's something you should know. I've been in situations far worse than this. And you? You don't even know the half of who I am." The crowd around the bus felt the shift in the air. It wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was something bigger, something that would demand consequences. The man's eyes widened as he tried to process what was happening, unsure if this was a game or a real warning. "You see," the bus driver went on, "I've served my country. I've served people like you, whether you know it or not. I've been places where people like you wouldn't even dare to go. And today, I'm going to remind you what respect really looks like." The tension in the air was electric. The man, a stranger to any form of humility, suddenly felt as though the ground beneath him was shaking. This wasn't a simple verbal exchange anymore. It was something deeper, something life-altering. The bus driver reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a badge. The man stared at it, his jaw dropping as he saw the symbol of authority he hadn't recognized before. "I don't need you to be afraid," the bus driver said softly. "But maybe it's time you learn that some people aren't meant to be disrespected. Not by anyone, no matter their background or where they come from." The crowd stood in stunned silence. The man's face turned a shade of pale that would rival the whitest snow. His bravado had evaporated, leaving him standing there exposed and vulnerable. Who are you?" the man stammered, his voice barely audible. The bus driver stood tall, his presence commanding. "I'm someone you should never have underestimated. Now, you'll answer for your actions." The next moments felt like they were unfolding in slow motion. The man stumbled back, his body shaking as the weight of the situation dawned on him. The bus driver wasn't just some random person. He was someone who commanded respect, someone with a history far beyond what anyone could have imagined. As the bus driver reached for the intercom, he spoke calmly, but with authority. "This man," he announced to the passengers, "has just been given a lesson in humility, and it's a lesson he will never forget." With that, he turned to the man, his eyes steely and unblinking. "You're going to come with me. We're going to have a serious conversation about your behavior." In the aftermath, the bus was eerily quiet. The man was escorted off the bus, and the passengers were left in awe of what they had just witnessed. The bus driver had done more than just stand up to the man. He had shown what it truly meant to demand respect, even in the face of hatred. The man's actions would now be remembered, not as the victim of some passing insult, but as the person who had learned, in the hardest possible way, the true meaning of respect. And while the details of the bus driver's life remained a mystery, one thing was certain: he wasn't someone to be trifled with. As the bus drove away from the scene, the passengers sat in silence, reflecting on the event that had just unfolded. The bus driver, still at the front of the vehicle, didn't boast or show any signs of triumph. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, knowing that what he had done wasn't about winning a fight. It was about teaching a lesson. For the man who had shouted at him, the story would live on. And for everyone on that bus, they would never forget the day when respect, humility, and a hard lesson in dignity played out right in front of them.